Shalom Beth El family. Well, the Chagim are finally behind us. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeres, Simchat Torah, and we've resumed our regular Torah reading, and now we can resume our regular video Torah Talk recaps of the Parsha. This past Saturday in Shul, we read Parshat Bereshit, the very beginning of the Torah, and we spoke in synagogue about what it means to be a good neighbor, a talk that I called the Good Neighbor Mitzvah. And here's more or less what we spoke about. I started out by sharing a story that occurred to me going across the river on the ferry, something we do here in the Hampton Roads area a little more often than I got to do back when I was in New Jersey. And you know me, I'm a schmoozer. I like to talk to people. So I was speaking to one of the sailors, one of the ferry operators, and we were talking about, his job and how he liked it and such. And he told me, he was a sailor at heart. He was a lover of boats when he was a kid. And so he loves that he gets to get on a boat every day, even if it's just going back and forth across the river. And I said, but what is it, that you really love about boats, about working on boats? And he said, honestly, I like being part of a crew. So, look, I'm a kid from inland New Jersey. I don't know much about boats or being on a crew. So I said, well, how's that different from being on any kind of team? Couldn't you work anywhere and be on a team and it would have the same effect? And he said, no, being on a boat is different. On a boat, we're constantly thinking about each other. He said, if you want proof, this is an old thing we talk about on boats. Go sit down next to somebody on the bottom level of the ferry and start drilling a hole in the bottom of the boat. And when the person next to you, who will probably be disturbed by this, says, what are you doing? Say, what's it to you? It's not your problem what I do. This is my seat. Of course, it makes no sense. And I immediately realized, speaking to this this ferryman, that what he was saying was not really only about a boat. It might be obvious, more obvious on a boat, but it's really about how we live our lives. There may be no more un-Jewish question than, what's it to you? That might be the least Jewish question there is. It's at least the least neighborly question that there is. Sure, on a boat it's obvious because if someone drills in the bottom, everybody sinks together. But the truth is, Judaism has that same perspective on the world, right? When we affect something negatively that affects everybody else, that is all of our problems. In a sense, the world is our boat, and we are riding together, and therefore it is important for us all to take the best care of it that we can. We see that idea on display in this week's Torah reading. It is often asked, why does the Torah, and vis-a-vis the Torah, the entire Bible, start with Adam and Eve and their children? Right? If this document, the Torah, is the central text of Judaism, then why do we start dozens of generations before Abraham and Sarah, the first Jews? What is added to the Torah, to the story? What are we supposed to be getting out of Parshat Bereshit and Parshat Noach, which both come before the founding of Judaism, if you will? Well, I think that the Torah, in fact, is talking about mitzvot here in these opening chapters, these opening parshiot. And not just Jewish mitzvot, but concepts that are so fundamental to humanity that they are things we all need to worry about. We see it in the very first time two people have to live near one another. Right? Despite being brothers, Cain and Abel are the first neighbors. And they live in competition rather than in cooperation. Right? They view, or at least Cain views, his worth as measured by the value of his neighbor. And pretty soon that competition turns to jealousy, the jealousy turns to murder, and murder turns to moral decay that ultimately, in next week's Parsha, Noach, leads to destruction for all. Right? The flaw in the very start of human community, the flaw in the very first time two people are trying to live side by side, leads to the ultimate destruction of humanity and the world in the flood. And perhaps that's why there is such emphasis on being good neighbors in Judaism. Right? Most of us know the golden rule, love thy neighbor as thyself. And according to Rabbi Akiva, that is the central concept of Judaism. But for Jews, it's not just a nice aphorism. We have strict rules, right? We insist that we live an idea that's a central value to us to the extreme. And so we see it in teachings all around, in mitzvot, in ways we're supposed to behave. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch shared a teaching about this in the Hebrew word to dwell. And the word to dwell, as well as also is the same word for neighbor. Sorry, the word to dwell is the same word as the word for neighbor, right? Shachen. So in Jewish thought, to dwell, to live, to be settled in a place is integrally connected to being a neighbor. Says Rabbi Hirsch, when a Jew takes a place on the earth to be his dwelling place, he must at the same time concede space and domain to his fellow men for a similar dwelling place. Right? We are meant to make space for others, to live in community. We are not supposed to live in isolation. And so Jewish law insists that if we have things that will make life uncomfortable for our neighbors, right, it is our obligation to do whatever it takes to make them as least disturbing as possible. And so the Talmud demands that if we have a tannery or an outhouse or a laundry pit, all things that were apparently very smelly. I mean, an outhouse, but I guess, they would dig holes and put all their dirty clothes in it. Or a tannery, apparently making leather was an incredibly pungent process. Then you had to do it a good distance from your neighbor's property. In fact, Maimonides, the Rambam, the 12th century scholar, who was the first to really compile Jewish law into a legal code as we would understand it today, he has an entire section of that document on the laws of neighborliness. And it's clearly no mistake. It is clear from the start how central neighborliness is to being Jewish. Because that same root, shachen, the root to dwell and to be a neighbor that Rabbi Hirsch talks about, that is also the root of Shekhinah, right? The Spirit of God that dwells with us on earth, the form of God that dwells with us on earth, right? Shekhinah is connected to living in community, right? It's implicit that only when we are living positively in community with our neighbors are we really able to have that sense of holiness, to sense the Shekhinah, to sense that ever-dwelling presence with us. The message is that it is our religious duty to be concerned about our neighbors, the ones who live next door to us, and the ones in the greater community. We only have an obligation, not to ourselves, but we have an obligation to make sure that we are not a nuisance to those who are around us. And not only that we are not a nuisance, but we have a responsibility to make the community better in a way that will benefit everyone. Right? In Judaism, we believe in getting into the business of our neighbors, to help and to raise everyone up. Right? It's just like that boat metaphor again. Right? If it sinks, everybody sinks. But also if the tide brings up the boat, it brings up everybody. Living in community as a Jewish person means doing everything we can to make sure that is the case. And that sometimes runs counter to American culture. Right? But Judaism demands it of us. American culture, we have this sort of mind your own business attitude. Well, I don't really think that's right, but it's not my business. Not in Judaism. Judaism, we are in people's business. We want to help. That clash, I always think of it as being seen in a poem that we're almost all familiar with, right? Robert Frost's poem, "The Mending Wall," right? And if you download the attached sources, I put the end of "The Mending Wall" in your in that attached source, right? But we're all familiar with the poem from one phrase, right? Good fences make good neighbors. And when we talk about having separation from our neighbors, we often quote this poem. Well, you know, good fences make good neighbors. But if you read Robert Frost's poem, he's actually saying exactly the opposite. Right? The poem is about him and his neighbor, and they're walking this stone wall on their properties together every spring after the damage from the winter, and each one picks up the rocks on their side of the wall and they put it back. And Robert Frost didn't like having a wall with his neighbor. He says, walls are for cattle, right? I don't have cattle. I have pine trees. And my neighbor, he says, has apple trees. So I'm pretty sure that his apple trees are not going to invade my property. And my pine trees are also pretty tame. And he'll make this point to his neighbor, and his neighbor will say, as his father said before him, well, good fences make good neighbors. It is one of the great ironies of American literature that Robert Frost is actually saying no, right? We're good neighbors when we know each other, when we don't have walls between us. And now it's quoted all the time to say, the exact opposite. But in Judaism, we know that we don't believe in good fences make good neighbors. In Judaism, we have rules to guide our thinking and our activities so that we always remember that we are on this boat together. The tide raises us up together, and when we sink, we drown together. And so, I hope we can use this reminder from Parshat Bereshit to think about how we evaluate our own actions vis-a-vis our community and how we interact with each other. It is not always easy. It does not always seem like the American thing to do, to get into the business of those around us. But it certainly is the Jewish thing to do. We do not want to follow the example of Cain and Abel. We do not want to follow the example of those who create separation and competition and animosity for no particular reason. We want to be more like Robert Frost and less like his neighbors. Judaism demands it of us. That is our good neighbor guarantee. That is our good neighbor mitzvah. And when we can all strive to be those kinds of good neighbors, not only will we enjoy life more and the sense of community we enjoy, but you know what? We'll live in a better place and in a better world too. I hope that can all come to fruition as we move forward in the Torah readings. And hopefully I will see you again next week for Parshat Noach.